The city of Nice was filled with troops, among which was a squadron of the 1st Hussars, to which I belonged. This regiment, in the absence of its colonel, was commanded by a very brave squadron leader named Müller. He was the father of that poor unfortunate adjutant of the 7th Hussars who was wounded by a cannon shot near me at Waterloo. Upon learning that the divisional general had just arrived, Commander Müller went to see my father, and they agreed that, after a few days of rest, I would begin serving in the 7th Company, commanded by Captain Mathis, a man of merit who later became a colonel under the Empire and a brigadier general under the Restoration. Although my father was very kind to me, I was so intimidated in his presence that I behaved with extreme timidity, a trait he believed even greater than it actually was. He used to say I should have been a girl, and often called me Mademoiselle Marcellin. This hurt me deeply, especially now that I was a hussar. It was to overcome this shyness that my father wanted me to serve with my comrades. Moreover, as I have already said, one could only enter the army as a simple soldier. My father could, it is true, have kept me at his side, since my regiment was part of his division, but, aside from the reasoning above, he wanted me to learn how to saddle and bridle my horse, care for my weapons, and did not want his son to enjoy even the slightest privilege, which might have caused resentment among the troops. It was already a great favor that I was admitted into the squadron without having to undergo a long and tedious apprenticeship at the depot. I spent several days exploring the surroundings of Nice with my father and his staff, which are very beautiful. But when the time came for me to join the squadron, my father asked Commander Müller to send him the Sergeant Pertelet. Now, you should know that there were 2 brothers in the regiment with that name, both sergeants, but with no physical or moral resemblance between them. One might think that the author of the play The Two Philiberts had taken these 2 men as models, the elder Pertelet being Philibert the scoundrel, and the younger Pertelet, Philibert the virtuous. It was the latter the colonel had meant to designate as my mentor, but due to the short time he had spent with my father, Colonel Picquart had forgotten to specify the younger when naming Pertelet, and moreover, that one was not in the squadron then stationed in Nice, whereas the elder Pertelet served precisely in the 7th Company, in which I was about to be placed. Commander Müller thus assumed it was the elder who had been mentioned, and that this wild character was chosen to break in a young man as gentle and shy as I was. He therefore sent us the elder Pertelet. This typical old-school hussar was a drinker, rowdy, quarrelsome, a swordsman, but also brave to the point of recklessness. Otherwise, completely ignorant of anything not related to his horse, his weapons, and his service before the enemy. The younger Pertelet, in contrast, was gentle, polite, well-educated, and as he was quite handsome and just as brave as his brother, he would have certainly risen quickly if, still very young, he had not died on the battlefield. But back to the elder. He arrived at my father's, and what a sight! A rough fellow, admittedly well-groomed, but with his shako tilted rakishly, his sabre dragging, a face florid and bisected by a massive scar, moustaches half a foot long curled up with wax, vanishing into his ears, and 2 thick braids at his temples, dangling from his shako onto his chest, and all that accompanied by a roguish air enhanced by jerky speech and a Franco-Alsatian gibberish among the harshest. This last defect did not surprise my father, as he knew the 1st Hussars was the former Bercheny regiment, which had historically only accepted Germans and used German for commands up until 1793. Most of the officers and hussars were born in the Rhine border provinces. Still, my father was stunned by the attitude, responses, and duelist swagger of my mentor. I later learned that he had hesitated to place me under the guidance of such a character, but Mr. Galt had reminded him that Colonel Picquart had called this man the best non-commissioned officer in the squadron, and so my father decided to give it a try. I followed Pertelet, who nonchalantly took me by the arm, brought me to my room, showed me how to pack my belongings into my saddlebag, and then led me to a small barracks in an old convent occupied by the squadron. My mentor had me saddle and unsaddle a lovely little horse my father had purchased for me, showed me how to place my cloak and weapons, and then gave me a full demonstration. When everything was done, he figured it was time for dinner, as my father, wishing for me to dine with my mentor, had provided a generous allowance for that expense. Berthellet took me to a small inn, the dining room filled with hussars, grenadiers, and soldiers of all kinds. They served us, and placed on the table a massive bottle of strong red wine, of the harshest kind, from which Berthellet poured me a full glass. We toasted. He drained his glass, but I set mine down without tasting it, for I had never drunk pure wine before, and its smell was unpleasant to me. I admitted this to my mentor, who then shouted in a booming voice, "Boy, bring a lemonade for this lad who never drinks wine." Peals of laughter erupted throughout the room. I was mortified, but still could not bring myself to drink the wine, nor did I dare ask for water, so I dined without drinking anything. Learning the life of a soldier is difficult at any time. It was especially so at the time I speak of. I therefore endured several hard moments, but what seemed intolerable to me was the requirement to sleep with another hussar, as regulations allowed only one bed for every 2 soldiers. Only non-commissioned officers had individual beds. The first night I spent in the barracks, I had just gotten into bed when a tall hussar arrived an hour later. He approached my bed, saw someone was already there, took down the lamp and held it to my face for a closer look, then undressed. While I watched him, I did not think for a moment he meant to join me in bed, but I was quickly disabused of the notion when he said gruffly, "Move over, conscript." Then he climbed in, took up 3/4 of the bed, and started snoring loudly. It was impossible for me to sleep, especially due to the awful smell coming from a large bundle my bedfellow had tucked under the pillow to raise his head. I couldn't imagine what it was. To find out, I carefully slipped my hand toward it and discovered a leather apron, reeking of the pitch used by cobblers to wax their thread. My delightful bedmate was one of the shoemaker's assistants for the regiment. I was so disgusted that I got up, got dressed, and went to the stables to sleep on a bundle of straw. The next day, I told Berthellet of my misadventure, and he reported it to the sub-lieutenant of the platoon. This man was well-mannered and named Leistenschneider, in German, lapidary. He later became a colonel under the Empire, first aide-de-camp to Bessières, and was killed in action. Mr. Leistenschneider, understanding how unpleasant it must be for me to share a bed with a cobbler, arranged for me to be given a bed in the non-commissioned officer's room, which pleased me greatly. Although the revolution had brought a great relaxation in military discipline, the 1st Hussars had always maintained their appearance as strictly as when it was still the Bercheny regiment. Thus, except for the physical differences imposed by nature, all cavalrymen were expected to look alike in terms of dress. At that time, Hussar regiments not only wore a queue, but also long side braids, and their mustaches were curled upward. Everyone in the corps was expected to have mustaches, a queue, and braids. Since I had none of these, my mentor took me to the squadron barber, where I purchased a false queue and braids, which were attached to my hair, already somewhat long, as I had been growing it out since my enlistment. This get-up bothered me at first, but I soon got used to it, and even liked it, because I imagined it made me look like an old hussar. But the mustaches were another story. I didn't have a trace of facial hair, and since a bare face would have spoiled the look of the squadron, Berthellet, following Bercheny tradition, took a pot of black wax and with his thumb crafted 2 enormous curls that, covering my upper lip, nearly reached my eyes. At that time, shakos had no visors, and during reviews or while standing guard, positions in which one must remain perfectly still, the Italian sun, beaming down on my face, would dry out the wax in my fake mustaches, pulling at my skin in a most unpleasant way. Still, I didn't flinch. I was a hussar. That word had something magical for me. Moreover, having embraced a military career, I fully understood that my first duty was to conform to regulations. My father and part of his division were still in Nice when news arrived of the events of the 18th Brumaire, the fall of the Directory, and the establishment of the consulate. My father had long despised the Directory and did not mourn its passing, but he feared that, intoxicated by power, General Bonaparte would not stop at the modest title of consul after restoring order to France. He predicted that in a short time Bonaparte would seek to make himself king. My father was wrong only about the title. Napoleon made himself emperor 4 years later. Whatever his forecasts for the future, my father was glad not to have been in Paris during the 18th Brumaire, and I believe that had he been there, he would have strongly opposed General Bonaparte's undertaking. But in the army, commanding a division at the front, he chose to confine himself to the passive obedience of the soldier. He rejected proposals from several generals and colonels to march on Paris with their troops. "Who," he told them, "will defend the borders if we abandon them, and what will become of France if we add the calamities of civil war to our foreign conflicts?" By such wise observations, he restrained those with more extreme impulses. Still, he was deeply affected by the coup d'etat. He idolized his homeland and wished it could be saved without being subjected to a master's yoke. I've said that by making me serve as a simple hussar, my father intended to rid me of the somewhat silly schoolboy air that my brief time in Parisian society had not erased. The result surpassed his expectations. Living among rowdy hussars and having a mentor who laughed at my missteps, I began howling with the wolves and, afraid of being mocked for my shyness, became a real devil. Still, I wasn't yet bad enough to be admitted to a kind of brotherhood which, under the name clique, had members in every squadron of the 1st Hussars. The clique was composed of the rowdiest troublemakers and the bravest soldiers in the regiment. Its members supported one another at all costs, especially in battle. They called each other loustics, and recognized each other by a notch cut into the tin of the first button on the right-hand row of their pelisse and dolman. The officers knew of the clique's existence, but since its worst offenses were limited to cleverly stealing a few chickens or sheep, or playing pranks on the locals, and since the loustics were always the first to face fire, the commanders turned a blind eye. I was such a scatterbrain that I very much wanted to be part of this band of ruffians. It seemed to me that doing so would establish my standing among my comrades. But no matter how often I visited the fencing hall, learned to thrust, counter-thrust, use the saber, pistol and carbine, elbowed everything in my path, let my saber drag, and cocked my shako to one side, the members of the clique still saw me as a child and refused to admit me. A sudden turn of events changed everything, and here is how it happened. The army of Italy was then occupying Liguria and stretched along a line more than 60 leagues long, with its right at the Gulf of La Spezia, beyond Genoa, its center at Finale, and its left at Nizza and the Var, which was the border of France. Thus, we had the sea at our backs and faced Piedmont, occupied by the Austrian army, from which we were separated by the ridge of the Apennines, stretching from the Var to Gavi. In this precarious position, the French army was at risk of being cut in two, which happened a few months later, but let us not get ahead of the story. My father, ordered to gather his division at Savona, a small coastal town 10 leagues short of Genoa, set up his headquarters in the bishop's palace. The infantry was spread out across nearby towns and villages to monitor the valleys through which roads and paths from Piedmont emerged. The 1st Hussars, who had marched from Nice to Savona, were encamped in a plain called La Madonna. The enemy outposts were at Dego, 4 or 5 leagues away, on the opposite slope of the Apennines, whose peaks were snow-covered, while Savona and its surroundings enjoyed mild weather. Our bivouac would have been delightful had food been more plentiful. But since there was no proper road from Nice to Genoa, and the sea was swarming with English cruisers, the army lived off what a few mule detachments brought along the Corniche or from the cargoes of small boats that slipped unnoticed along the coast. These meager resources barely sufficed to provide grain for the troops day to day. Fortunately, the region produced a lot of wine, which sustained the soldiers and helped them endure the privations with more resignation. One day, in fine weather, Master Pertelet, my mentor, and I were walking along the seashore when he spotted a tavern in a lovely garden filled with orange and lemon trees, under which tables were arranged and surrounded by soldiers of all arms. He suggested we go in. Although I had yet to overcome my aversion to wine, I followed him out of politeness. It is worth mentioning that at the time, cavalry belts had no hooks, so when we were on foot, we had to hold the sabre's scabbard in the left hand and let its tip drag on the ground. This made a noise on the pavement and gave a rowdy air. That alone had convinced me to adopt the style. But as we entered the garden, the tip of my sabre's scabbard touched the foot of a huge mounted artilleryman sprawled out on a chair with his legs stretched forward. Horse artillery, then called flying artillery, had been formed at the start of the Revolutionary Wars from volunteers drawn from grenadier companies who took the opportunity to rid themselves of the most unruly elements. These flying gunners were famous for their bravery, but also for their love of brawls. The one whose foot I had brushed with my sabre barked in a loud, rough voice, "Hussar, your sabre drags far too much." I was about to keep walking without replying when Master Pertelet nudged my elbow and whispered, "Tell him, come lift it." So I said to the gunner, "Come lift it." "That will be easy," he replied. And Pertelet whispered again, "We'll see about that." At those words, the gunner, or rather, this Goliath, for he was nearly 6 feet tall, sat up with a threatening look. But my mentor jumped between us. All the gunners in the garden immediately took their comrade's side, but a crowd of hussars joined Pertelet and me. Tempers flared, everyone shouted at once, and I thought a full melee was about to erupt. But the hussars, being at least 2-1, stayed calmer. The artillerymen saw that if they drew their sabres, they would be outmatched, and it was finally explained to the giant that by brushing his foot with my sabre tip, I had not meant any offense, and the matter should end there. But during the scuffle, a trumpet player from the artillery, about 20 years old, had come up to insult me, and in my anger, I had shoved him so hard he fell head-first into a mud-filled ditch. It was then decided that he and I would duel with sabres. We left the garden, followed by all the onlookers, and made our way to the shore, where fine, firm sand awaited our duel. Pertelet knew I was reasonably skilled with the sabre. Still, he gave me a few tips on how to attack, and tied the sabre hilt to my hand with a large handkerchief wrapped around my arm. Now is the moment to mention that my father detested dueling, not just for philosophical reasons, but also because in his youth, while in the king's bodyguard, he had served as second for a dear friend who was killed in a duel over a trivial matter. For that reason, whenever my father assumed command, he ordered the gendarmerie to arrest and bring before him any soldier caught dueling. Though the trumpet player and I knew this order, we were still sabre in hand and dolman off. I had my back to Savona. My opponent faced it, and we were about to begin when I saw the trumpet player suddenly leap aside, grab his dolman, and flee. "Ah, coward!" I shouted. "You run!" I was about to chase him when 2 iron hands grabbed my collar from behind. I turned my head and found myself surrounded by 8 or 10 gendarmes. I then understood why my opponent had fled, as had all the spectators I saw sprinting away, including Master Pertelet, each afraid of being arrested and brought before the general. So there I was, a prisoner and disarmed. I put my dolman back on and, looking sheepish, followed my guards, saying nothing of my name. They brought me to the bishop's palace where my father was staying. At that moment, he was with General Suchet, later Marshal, who had come to Savona for military discussions. They were walking in a gallery overlooking the courtyard. The gendarmes presented me to General Marbot, unaware I was his son. The brigadier explained the reason for my arrest. My father, adopting a stern tone, gave me a sharp reprimand. After that, he told the brigadier, "Take this hussar to the citadel." I left without saying a word, and General Suchet, who did not know me, never guessed that the scene he had just witnessed was between a father and son. It was only the next day that he learned of our relationship, and he often laughed about it with me later. At the citadel, an old Genoese fort near the harbor, I was locked in a vast room lit only by a small window facing the sea. Gradually, I recovered from the shock. The scolding I had just received seemed deserved. Still, I was less troubled by having disobeyed the general than by having upset my father. I spent the rest of the day in a rather gloomy mood. That evening, an old Genoese invalid soldier brought me a jug of water, a piece of army bread, and a bundle of straw on which I lay down without eating. I could not sleep, both because I was too shaken and because of the huge rats darting around me and eventually making off with my bread. In the dark, lost in my sad reflections, around 10 o'clock, I heard the locks of my prison opening. I saw Spire, my father's old and faithful servant. He told me that after I was sent to the citadel, Colonel Ménard, Captain Gault, and all my father's officers had pleaded for my pardon, which the general granted, instructing Spire to retrieve me and deliver the order for my release to the fort's governor. I was taken before Governor-General Bouguet, a good man who had lost an arm in the war. He knew me and liked my father very much. After returning my saber, he gave me a lengthy lecture, which I listened to patiently, thinking that my father's would be even worse. I did not feel brave enough to face it, and resolved to avoid him for a few days and return to my bivouac at La Madonna. I could have slipped away quietly, but fearing Spire would chase me by the light of his lantern, I kicked it 10 paces away and ran while he groped in the dark, shouting, "Ah, little rascal! I'm telling your father, he was right to put you with those Bercheny hussars. Fine school of scoundrels." After wandering a while through the silent streets, I finally found my way back to La Madonna and reached the regiment's bivouac. Everyone thought I was still in prison. As soon as I was recognized by firelight, I was surrounded, questioned, and laughter broke out as I described how I had evaded the servant sent to return me to the general. The members of the clique especially were thrilled by this show of spirit and unanimously decided to admit me into their ranks. That very night, they were preparing an expedition to the gates of Dego to capture a herd of oxen belonging to the Austrian army. French generals and unit leaders had to turn a blind eye to raids conducted beyond the outposts to secure provisions, since regular supply was impossible. In every regiment, the bravest soldiers formed bands of foragers with a remarkable knack for finding enemy supply points and using cunning and daring to seize them. A shady horse trader had informed the first hussars clique that a herd of oxen he had sold to the Austrians was penned in a meadow a quarter league from Dego. 60 hussars, armed only with carbines, set out to seize them. We traveled several leagues through mountainous, dreadful back roads to avoid the main route, and surprised 5 Croats guarding the herd, asleep under a shed. To keep them from alerting the Dego garrison, we tied them up and left them there, then drove off the herd without a fight. We returned to bivouac exhausted, but delighted to have outwitted our enemies and secured provisions. I mention this only to illustrate the dire straits in which the army of Italy already found itself, and to show how completely abandonment can throw troops into disorganization, where officers are forced not only to tolerate such raids, but to use the spoils without seeming to know their source. That concludes the 5th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.